Hi, folks. I hope you're all well and having a good day. I thought I would do a small lecture about critical thinking for you to get you thinking about the different issues related to critical thinking. So, this is something that's quite hard to describe. It's not the easiest thing in the world to try and get someone to understand what critical thinking is and why it's required. So, I thought I'd try and do this using a couple of different things. So, one of the things that I do in this specific lecture is that I use old advertisements to help you think or understand how our thinking has become critical in contemporary times, and hopefully you'll get that message as we're going through. I'm also going to walk through a bit of an example to show you how to think critically, the types of things that we need to do in order to do that. And most importantly, I'll talk about why it's important for police folks and so forth. So what does a critical thinker do? They establish the difference between fact and opinion. They ask questions, make detailed observations, uncover assumptions and define their terms. And of course, make assumptions based on, assertions based on sound logic and solid evidence. So it seems simple enough, and often it can be, but sometimes it requires a bit more work if you're really trying to think outside the boundaries of something that we've thought about in a certain way for a long time. So I particularly like this image here. It's quite a famous one now. Homosexuality is a sin. Christ can set you free. And this guy draws up a sign saying corduroy skirts are a sin. So he's a bit of a critical thinker. He's thought of a different way to engage with that situation that he's found a little bit uncomfortable. Why do we need critical thinking in policing? There are two really great quotes from the work of Phillips and Burrell that talk about this in a bit more detail. We need to develop an advanced level of thinking and planning skills so that countermeasures can be developed to stop criminal catastrophes before they occur. So that's most important. So it's the preventive approach rather than reactive approach of looking at what we can do after an event has occurred. So the way that they describe this process for law enforcement is about creating multiple solutions to problems by constantly questioning and challenging their strengths and examining decision-making preferences and practices. Thinking is fueled by questions define variables, state factors, outline tasks, clarify issues, and express problems in different ways. Complex questioning drives thought beyond what is superficial and historical. Asking questions forces everyone involved in the decisions to express and challenge preconceived notions and assumptions. There are so many different levels to this, and there are many, many different ways that might unfold in the policing setting. But it's being aware of this that really helps us to understand what's going on. So I've just given you a few definitions of critical thinking. I'm not going to go through these in any detail and try and unpack them and all of that sort of stuff. But just to point out a few major characteristics, and of course pairing this with some old advertisements, which hopefully are fairly self-explanatory in terms of where we've come from as, a group of human beings, where we are now, and why it's important for us to critically think about some of these issues. So, this ad here that says, blow in her face and she'll follow you anywhere, which is a very inappropriate statement these days. I'm sure most people would agree. So critical thinking is best understood as the ability of thinkers to take charge of their own thinking. It requires that they develop sound criteria and standards for analysing and assessing their own thinking and routinely use those criteria. So it's always just about stepping out of that box. Critical thinking implies curiosity, skepticism, reflection and rationality. Critical thinkers have a propensity to raise and explore questions about beliefs, claims, evidence, definitions, conclusions and actions. So in this particular advertisement, we have doctors saying that they, smoke Camel cigarettes because they're good for them apparently. It's the doctor's choice of cigarette in America. of course, we know now that cigarettes kill you, and most doctors wouldn't probably smoke as a general rule. So we've come from a time where it was totally acceptable and quite cool for people to smoke, to now, looking at that really critically, looking at the evidence that was mounting in the 70s and 80s, and we've moved beyond that kind of certain way of thinking about smoking and so forth, because we've had a look at the claims, we've looked at the evidence, we've looked at definitions, conclusions, and actions, and we've come to a different way of thinking about it. Critical thinking is the ability and willingness to assess claims and make objective judgments on the basis of well-supported reasons. This is the ability to look for flaws in arguments, resist claims that have no supporting evidence. Critical thinking is not merely negative thinking. It also fosters the ability to be creative and constructive and generate new ways of thinking about the findings and implications, so that we can think differently about a broader range of social and personal problems. So the claim being made in this particular advertisement is quite clear. It's that, it's the sexualization of this young girl in this particular image. And of course, we've come to a point now where we probably think about that sort of stuff as fairly problematic, particularly around children. So critical thinking is about analysing, being reflective, asking questions, being skeptical but constructive in one's skepticism rather than just, tearing people apart. We need to weigh up the evidence and, if need be, take this further by formulating possible alternatives. It means thinking seriously about what we have read or heard. Skepticism means not taking it for granted and constantly challenging whether or not what we've heard is true and correct. Now, there's a bit of a framework that we can use to try and help work through this, which is The Sociological Imagination by C. Wright Mills. It's a really great little framework. I'm going to walk you through this. It helps you shift from a focus on the individual that blames them for their problem to an understanding of social structure and the historical context, and sort of going back to the individual and then looking at their circumstances again through that new lens. It requires us to think beyond the individual trouble and set this trouble into a social and historical context. Now, I'm not sure if you recognise what this photo is on the slide. It's a picture of a massive apartment block that they typically have in places like Europe, London, so forth. It's cheap accommodation for people who can't afford, townhouses in Kensington or whatever. Now, the reason I've put this up there is because I use a personal example to talk through the sociological imagination. When I was younger and had 2 kids, we couldn't afford to buy a house anywhere in Brisbane. It was far too expensive. So we bought this very small unit in a unit block. And when we told our families about doing this, my goodness, you'd think that we'd cut their throats. They just complained bitterly. It's not right to have children in a unit. You need to buy a house so they've got a yard. All of these assumptions were just flying at us at a quite great rate, I must say. They had built up this idea in their minds that the great Australian dream, or it was the right of children and families in Australia to have a house with a backyard. We didn't think that that was necessarily needed, and we bought the unit because we couldn't afford anything else, obviously. So our circumstances dictated what we do. So the individual perspective here that was coming out of the mouths of our friends and family was that we had done something wrong and we were to blame for making a bad choice. The social and historical circumstances were we both came from families that didn't have any money whatsoever. In fact, I was the first in family to go to university, and my partner hadn't gone to university. And the social circumstances were, and even financial and economic in this instance, were that we couldn't afford anything within that we could live in that was affordable for us at that particular time. So we reverted to buying a unit because it was the logical choice. Now, if we look at the broader historical social circumstances of that decision, there are many people that live in these types of circumstances overseas, and they do so for their entire lives. So it's the socialization process that our friends and family have gone through that led them to make these assumptions and to, sort of overlay their opinions, I suppose, onto our circumstances. And of course, we felt massively guilty about that process. So the critical thinking framework here that C. Wright Mills talks about helps us move away from blaming the individual and considering that broader social context and thinking about the cultural context as well in other circumstances internationally to better understand the individual choices that people make and to better understand, most importantly, that they're perhaps not always a choice. So this is why I like his framework. And I try and get people to use it. It helps us think ourselves away from the familiar routines of our daily lives in order to look at them differently. The sociological imagination allows us to see that many events that seem to only concern the individual actually reflect larger social issues. So another example that I use is these two covers of magazines. They are a bit crazy, but they do such a great job at demonstrating very well what it means to be a critical thinker. So we've got here a cover of Cosmopolitan magazine. We've got, I think it's one of the Kardashians, yes, Kim Kardashian, and she talks about how, they need to be concerned, people need to be concerned about their bodies and all of those types of things, talking about sex, Facebook fashion, all of that type of stuff, right? And there's certain sensibilities that are working through this particular cover about body image, the way women should look, blah, 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 blah. Then we go to the other side, which is overanalyzing, a cover that's been created by a feminist thinker, I guess, in terms of how body image issues can really impact on women. So the messages that we're giving women, such as sex, you're doing it wrong, tone your butt until you're hot enough to be offended when guys appreciate it, how to lose weight overnight, cut off your leg. So it's sort of a piss take of all of the different assumptions that work through the cover of magazines like Cosmopolitan. So it's the critical thinking magazine cover, I suppose, and it helps to really think through what's going on there. Anyway, it's one of the ones that really helps me think about what does it mean to be a critical thinker. It's not so much taking the piss, but thinking critically and broadly about the different issues there. And most importantly, unpacking those issues that might blame a young woman who has eating disorders because that we have, magazine covers like this all over the world every day. And the overanalyzing cover helps us think, well, actually, they're not to blame. It's the social messages going on here, which are teaching them that they're inadequate in different ways. So I've decided to work through an example, but very quickly, because I don't have any of you in the room with me. So we've got, the way that I tend to think about the sociological imagination is to think outside the box, right? We've got this black box or way of thinking about something, and we need to think outside it. So this is our box. Violent youth gangs take control of the streets. This was an incident that occurred in 2008. Young boys running around, and they were, being violent, all of those types of things. They were running around with a cleaver and stabbing people, or a young person was stabbed, I believe, a student, and they talk about gangs and so forth. Taking control of the street, right? So this is our way of thinking about it. If we look at the common sense explanations for this, we might say things like Young people are out of control, parents are not disciplining their children enough, they're not supervising their young people enough, and young people are inherently bad and rotten. But if we look a little bit further afield and we apply the sociological imagination, we come up with a whole bunch of different explanations that might be possible. So the social circumstances that young people live in, the fact that they spend a lot more time in public spaces, the fact that they may have to fight for basic needs that we take for granted as people who have houses and so forth. They come into contact with police a lot more, and they may feel really resentful of a lot of those types of interactions. And they may have social circumstances which lead them to being there. So the research that I do says that they might be in public space a lot more because of their sexuality and or gender diversity, for instance. And of course, they may be judged in particular ways for what they wear. And in fact, there still are jurisdictions in Australia that have laws in place around hoodies and the fact that they're not allowed to wear them. So all of these things might help us, think, well, what's going on here a little bit more? What assumptions are being made about young people in relation to the idea that they're in a gang of youths, for instance? So if we think critically about young people's involvement in gangs, then we come up with explanations like this. So family violence, drinking parent, so forth, and the fact that they need to leave home. They hang out with other young people in order to feel safe. And in fact, it's probably the only way that they can stay safe, particularly for young women who are seeking refuge from sexual assault and violence a lot of time. So all of these things are things that we need to unpack when we're thinking critically. We look at the social and historical context as opposed to blaming that young person for being part of that group of young people. And just so you know, we still don't have much evidence, research evidence across the board that says that we actually have youth gangs in Australia. So we look at questions like, what are the personal troubles? How can these personal troubles be linked back to the social context? How can they be illuminated by an understanding of history? And then how does that help us rethink the situation of that person or those people? So the characteristics of a critical thinker then: inquisitiveness, concern to become and remain well informed. It's not enough to just read that newspaper article and go, oh yeah, well there must be young people running around everywhere being nasty. We have to become well informed. So we go to the AIC site, we look at crime statistics around young people. Have they actually been involved in more crime? No, we have no evidence to suggest that crime amongst young people is going up. In fact, over the last 20 years at least, it's been going steadily down. Alertness to opportunities to use critical thinking, self-confidence in their own ability to reason, and thinking, fairly outside the box in that sense. Open-mindedness regarding divergent worldviews. So if someone doesn't agree with what you say, then thinking and considering what they have to say. A good example of that might be during the marriage equality debate, someone talking about how they are very religious and they don't agree with it, and a person who is actually gay or lesbian, for instance, just sitting there and listening to what they have to say in a respectful manner rather than attacking them. Flexibility in considering alternatives and opinions, understanding opinions of other people's, fair-mindedness in appraising different forms of reasoning, honesty in the face of one's own biases, which can be pretty tough, I have to say. It can be pretty tough. Prejudices, stereotypes, egocentric tendencies. 20 years ago, if you asked me about the intersection between religion and sexuality and how people get quite angry about the way that religious ideologies think about sexuality, I just would have sat there and been completely intolerant to people who were religious. But over time, I've really done a lot of reading and thinking about this, particularly of the research and so forth, and tried to relearn about the ways in which we need to be respectful to people who come from specific religious backgrounds. It's not okay to stand there and attack them. So that sort of honesty takes time and practice, I would argue. Suspending or making or altering judgments and using prudence in that process, and willingness to reconsider and revise views where honest reflection suggests that change is warranted. So a good example of that one would be where, those movements in America where they try and change people's sexuality in particular. They put them through reversal therapy and so forth to try and change the homosexual ways and all of that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of people who have been part of these movements and in fact been head of really prominent organisations to change gay and lesbian people's minds for many years, 20 years or so. And a lot of them are now sort of coming out and saying, well, actually, that's not appropriate. And these are all the reasons why. So Phillips and Burrell talk about why police can be more effective by developing critical thinking. We need to overcome that there's only one right solution to organisational quandaries, that we need to eliminate mental blocks like biases, myths, false assumptions. We need to think before we act and make quick decisions without data. Sometimes it's impossible not to make quick decisions, but even 2 minutes of your time, go away to a private area, think very carefully before making a decision. That is a better thing than rushing into something. And asking other people, of course. Considering alignment with organisations' goals and values, writing down pros and cons, positives, negatives, getting opinions and feedback from others, establishing priorities about what the critical factors are and what the most important consideration is, looking for opportunities in any decision. Each mistake is an organisational learning or growth moment, as opposed to, not thinking outside the box and just pushing ahead. So thinking about the fact that it's okay to make mistakes, take risks, and it makes the organisation better. Making decisions with an understanding that variables and circumstances can change, changing a course of actions when strategies are not working, not making decisions by only looking backwards, but looking forwards, looking to the future in hope and optimism. They also note that officers need to be able to develop a keen ability to overcome and become self-aware of biases, false assumptions, myths, faulty paradigms that can hamper effective decision-making. Critical thinking is about learning how to overcome these biases, to make better managerial decisions, develop new activities so that they become part of permanent leadership. So all of these things, I hope, will help you think about critical thinking, how it's done, and how it relates to the world of policing work, because it's pretty important that we do that. And on that note, I'll leave you with this fabulous advertisement from Coca-Cola about giving it to your babies in the 1940s and 50s, and we're finished. Hope that was helpful, folks. Have a great day, and I'll chat soon. See you later.